So this is our Simondon reading group, continuing with Individuation, Volume 2. We're on the history of the notion of the individual, picking up from page 584 of the PDF at the section heading. Oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong page. Where are we? Skip ahead. Sorry, 591 of the PDF, the section heading The 18th Century. So last time we looked quickly at Malebranche and didn't have a lot to say because none of us really knows his work. But there's this phrase that Simondon picks up from Malebranche, and actually he uses it in Volume 1 a few times as well in the part on psychic individuation. This idea that that from Malebranche that we have this sort of inner motion or inner tendency to always go further. I forget the exact translation of how it's presented here, but it's this kind of inner tendency that the human being has to always sort of push further and progress and pursue individuation and not be sort of stuck at one stage or one sort of form of individuation. And so this is a principle or this idea that Simondon takes up from Malebranche and sort of incorporates into his own ideas in Volume 1 of Individuation. But we didn't see much in Malebranche that we wanted to sort of hold on to. In the Leibniz section, it was, so again, there was the question of individuation for Leibniz, where Leibniz sets out his philosophical system to a large extent in opposition to Spinoza. So instead of having this one substance of which everything is a mode, we have an infinite number of substances. Every portion of matter in the universe is a substance. And Simondon analyzes some of the consequences of this notion of this infinite number of substances and conceiving of individuals as substances. And so one of the consequences for Leibniz is that we have to sort of treat each substance as self-contained. He uses the expression that the monads or the substances have no windows into which qualities could climb in and out. And so we can't conceive of interaction of substances in the sense that maybe a more straightforward understanding of the relationships between entities would present it. So we can't think of like heat being heat as a quality being sort of passed from one substance to another. We instead have to think of each substance or each entity having its own sort of life history or its own course of development in which one loses heat and the other one gains heat, but not as any sort of passage from one to the other. And so this conception requires us to kind of take the entire life history of the substance to be sort of prepared at the beginning or contained in the concept of that substance at the outset of its creation. So the example that Leibniz gives is the true concept of Julius Caesar. If you have the concept that fully grasps the essence of Julius Caesar, this concept contains within it the fact that he would cross the Rubicon, the fact that he would be assassinated by Brutus and company. Like every event that occurs in the life of Julius Caesar is contained in the concept of Julius Caesar. And so this, of course, raises the problem of theodicy or the problem of evil. So if God creates the universe in such a way that every event that happens to every entity in that universe is already sort of predestined or already built into the concept of those entities at the outset, then it seems as if God is responsible for all of the evil that happens in the world, or everything, all the suffering, everything bad that happens in the world is something that God created. And so Leibniz's sort of attempt to deal with this problem is to argue that there's a kind of maximization of reality in the world that God performs. So there's sort of two orders of necessity within God's creation of the world, or within God. So there's the logical or metaphysical necessity, which concerns which essences are compossible, so are capable of producing a world together. So the essence of Julius Caesar, which involves him being assassinated, and the essence of Brutus, which involves him assassinating Julius Caesar. Those two essences are compossible, so they can join together to form a world. Whereas maybe some other essences would not be compossible. And so this is a metaphysical necessity that determines which essences are compossible. And then out of this sort of set of essences and the set of possible worlds that can be produced out of these essences, God selects through moral necessity, so not a metaphysical necessity, but a moral necessity, selects the one that contains the most reality. So out of all the essences out of all the possible worlds that consist of compossible essences, God selects the one that contains the most reality. And so one other formulation that we talked about that Leibniz gives is the greatest richness of phenomena with the simplest laws. So the idea is that the world is set up in such a way that as many different kinds of phenomena are produced with the simplest possible laws, or the simplest possible general principles of compossibility of essences. And so when Leibniz talks about this world as being the best possible world, he doesn't mean the best possible world for human beings, but rather the world that contains the greatest amount of essence, or the greatest amount of reality. And so this is supposed to be a kind of answer to the problem of evil, or the theodicy problem. It's meant to explain why God would create the world the way it is, even though from our human perspective, it seems to contain evil and suffering and so on. So there's it's only from our sort of limited perspective that the world seems to have this evil and suffering in it, whereas from the perspective of God, or from the universal perspective, there's the world is actually the most perfect it could be, in the sense of expressing or realizing the most reality possible. And so whether that's a satisfying answer or not, I think is another question, but that's sort of how Leibniz tries to deal with that problem. Yeah, so I think that's what we talked about mostly last time. So we'll begin this time with a brief section on the 18th century as a whole, and then have a long discussion of Rousseau that will probably last for this session and then into the next session. So if someone else would like to start reading the 18th century section.
Yeah, I can read. I'll just read this whole thing. The 18th century. Returning to what is original about man, the thought of the 18th century valorizes the particular qua negation of the universal, as though the universal were something artificial, something non-real. The individual consequently becomes the concretely singular and original being, but then it is the notion of order as creative force, of universality, that disappears. The being is no longer defined as that which possesses within it a capacity for constructive order, or which contains within its complete individual notion something of the order of the divine will, something of the order that the divine will has rendered a contingent real, whereas the divine understanding would grasp the necessity of this order the best, or as affirmative particular essence, albeit as interiority. Nevertheless, the paradox of individuality is revealed in yet another way. This individual originality cannot be absolutely terminated in existence alone. It not only needs to exist, but needs to express itself in order to be. Individuality seeks its complement in another form of information than order, the information of communication. Instead of constructing or being constructed, or uniting the will with naturing nature, the individual expresses itself. But the paradox of individuality is expressed in the fact that this expression becomes essentially ambiguous. The individual is destined to express itself, and this act of expression reacts on the individual structure. Subjective judgments are consequently submitted to a necessary ambivalence. The individual's interior and exterior communicate through consciousness, And the problem of individual unity is no longer that of the soul and the body, but that of the relation between the expressed being and the unexpressed being. For the fundamental difficulty persists to make information coextensive with the being is merely an optative and cannot serve to explain the initial reality of the individual being. The logical paradox of the 17th century here becomes a moral paradox. Expression in itself is profanation and consecration all at the same time, and it shows in each act the best and the worst of human activities, whence the essential ambivalence of expression as information for the individual. In the search for unity through unicity, the individual splits into two. So it seems like maybe the general idea here is that in trying to think the individual as a unity without accounting for its genesis, the 18th century runs into the same kind of participation problem, but here it's between, I guess, the unexpressed part of the individual and the expressed part.
Yeah, I think we can put this into perspective of sort of some of the, I guess, epochs of the individual that Simondon has set out in this history that we've been going through. So there's like the problem of participation that we saw in ancient Greek philosophy, which has to do with how the individual is connected to something sort of outside of itself, either through mediation by a community or through sort of solitude and separation from the community. So there's these sort of two contrary impulses that animate Greek philosophy in terms of how the individual can engage in participation in the ideas or in something external to itself. And then we saw in the early modern philosophy, so in the 17th century, Simondon presents the sort of organizing principle as being the principle of construction. So the problem that these philosophers are presented with is how to construct an individual, or how the object of knowledge is constructed for the individual. And what we're sort of passing to now in the 18th century is a problem of expression instead of construction. So the problem for the individual now is to express itself, and so the sort of paradox here is that when you this sort of notion of expression suggests that we want to sort of take what the individual already is, the unexpressed nature of the individual, and just take that nature and then express it. So the result of the expression should be the same content as what was contained in the individual before the expression. But if we can consider this expression process as being something essential to what the individual is, then just by virtue of that expression process itself, the individual has undergone some sort of change. So the result of the expression is not what the individual was before the expression. So if we think of, for example, like performing an action of some kind, you have an intention, I don't know, to write a great poem or whatever, and you perform some action and you write a poem, and it turns out it's not so great. It's kind of a mediocre poem. So your intention and the result of your action don't match each other. So your expression doesn't sort of express the content that you wanted to express. And so only when the expression matches the unexpressed content is the expression sort of fully adequate. But then at the same time, insofar as you are the creator of this great poem, you are no longer the same individual as you were before the creation of this great poem. You have transformed yourself, and by taking expression to be something essential to what an individual is, you make this transformation sort of inherent to the individual. So the expression has to both at the same time express without transforming what the individual already was, and then also transform the individual into sort of the fullest realization of that individual. And so this is the kind of paradox that the 18th century tries to deal with in various ways. how can we understand expression, these two different aspects of expression at the same time. And this is also sort of reflected in the two aspects of expression, in the sense that expression is a kind of profanation. So you're taking something, this sort of inner reality of the self, or this sort of sacred reality of the self, and you're sort of exposing it to the world, and you risk sort of profaning this sacred reality of the self. And then at the same time, it's a kind of consecration, in the sense that you are taking some element of the external world, whether it's like linguistic material or something like that, and you're sort of consecrating it with this sacred quality of the self, this sort of inner virtue of the self. And so the expression has both of these aspects at the same time, precisely because expression is this kind of paradoxical notion. And so we'll see this with the section on Rousseau about, the relationship between sort of the inner self and the expression of that inner self, and the sort of paradoxes you run into when you try to explain this relation between the inner and the outer. Okay, so yeah, this little bit on the 18th century is sort of a preview of what we're going to see in the next few sections. So let's sort of dive into the concrete analysis of the Rousseau section. So if someone else would like to read the first page or so.
I can take it.
Sure.
Rousseau. This is the approach we find in Rousseau. From the start, Rousseau notes that each individual knows only himself. Quote, I have often noticed that even among those who most pride themselves in knowing man, which hardly knows anyone but himself, it is even true that someone can know himself. End of quote. Self-knowledge does not arrive without the expression of this knowledge, because the rapport to others is loaded with information here, and is the equivalent of a Cartesian order. It is not to refute the other's judgment that Rousseau wants to make himself known, but its essential is the expression that some practical results in opinion. Beneath worldly opinion, there is the relation between subjects, and this relation is what has the power to arrange and give value to subjective realities. Such an act of expression is precisely above any apologetic intention, for it is superior in its constitutive power to any reality that it could defend. This expressive potential is manifested by the experience of the moral wound that we feel when we see ourselves disfigured and misunderstood in the judgments and others bear upon us. The fact that judgment is inadequate is more serious than its depreciative aspect. In this case, the injury is less offensive than the error, which renders us unrecognizable, foreign to ourselves, disordered and disorganized in the judgment that others bear upon us. What is foremost is not praise or blame, but the coherence and truth of the image of the subject in those judgments. Quotes. I made these observations above all in relation to myself, not in the judgment I have made of others, having soon felt like a separate type of being, but in those that others have made of me. End of quote. The analysis of the preamble to the Châtel manuscript shows that for Rousseau, the fact of making oneself known not only has the value of truth, also the value of an act of affirmation in being. This expression of self-knowledge is a veritable method with a universal meaning. Quote, concerning these remarks, I resolve to take an additional step for my readers in the knowledge of man by drawing from them, if possible, this unique and erroneous rule of always judging the heart of others by my own, while, on the contrary, it would be necessary most often to know one's own heart oneself based on reading into the hearts of others. End of quote. Rousseau wants to attain more than a comparison of oneself with another, because the comparison remains at the level of the terms. Order is a reality of relation that requires the non-confusion of terms. It is by becoming aware of the differences that oppose us to another person that we can attain this stable and non-relative knowledge of our being. Expression is the act within which the differences of individuals acquire stability. This is why one must, quote, know oneself and another, end of quote. Afterwards, the wound of the soul, the regret of having been judged badly by others, misunderstood, is a profound experience because it gives rise to the feeling of essential differences and introduces them into existence by expressing them so as to publish them in a way in which they are participable for everyone. By publishing his essential differences, the individual escapes from solitude. In the relation with others, there is a reactive causality between essential differences and the communication between individuals. The fact that essential differences are invested in the relation confers an infinite reality and infinite fruitfulness onto this relation. In this endeavor of expression, gravity and emphasis are explicable more nobly than by Husserl's pride. Pride instead encourages isolation. Only vanity urges on the will to make oneself known and well judged. And yet, Rousseau is not a vain person. Yeah? Or stop? Or continue?
Oh, sorry, I realized I was on mute. Yes, let's stop here. Thanks.
You're welcome. Sorry. Regarding pronunciation, Rousseau, like in French style, which one is the right one?
Well, it is a French name, so you can pronounce it in French if you'd like.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so for Rousseau, we have this sort of desire for self-expression, precisely because he considers himself to be a singular individual. So he's different from other people, and it's precisely because of this difference that he feels the need to express himself um, uh, and sort of make himself known. And he he sort of sets out in some of his autobiographical writings. He sets out the goal of sort of correcting the public's image of him. He thinks that there is a kind of conspiracy against him and we'll see more on this later. But he thinks that people are sort of telling stories about him that are inaccurate, and he wants to correct the public's image of himself. But that's a sort of secondary consideration, as opposed to the sort of pure self-expression that motivates more fundamentally the whole project of autobiography. And so he wants to sort of present this singular entity that is himself to the world and allow the world to sort of know him as he really is, as opposed to having a sort of distorted perception of him. And so again, it's not so much that he thinks that he's being unfairly treated and that he wants to sort of improve his standing in the world for some sort of practical purpose by sort of correcting that interpretation that the world has of him. But it's the sort of quality of being known as such that he's seeking. So he wants to make himself known as he really is, as opposed to allowing the world to have this distorted image of him. And so it's precisely in his singularity and the fact that he's an individual who is different from everyone else that he has this desire for self-expression, and so he wants others to judge him as a singular individual and not sort of compare him to others and sort of judge him in accordance with other people's form of existence or sort of style of living. Yeah, so we'll see. So Angus has posted this comment in the chat here. It seems like the problem is that there's a non-identity of expression versus subject of expression. Yeah, so we'll see more on this as we continue with this section. But as soon as you have this sort of goal of making yourself known, of expressing yourself as you are, then this paradox of expression that we saw in the beginning of the 18th century section sort of arises because if this self-expression, if making yourself known is something that is sort of fundamental importance to you, to who you are as a person, as it was for Rousseau, there's then it sort of becomes impossible to express yourself as you are, because you by virtue of expressing yourself, you change who you are. And so he sort of sets up this duality, as we'll see later on, between the inner self and the external self, and he tries to overcome this duality in various ways, but there's this sort of fundamental split within the person that he's unable to fully overcome. Okay, let's go on to the next page or so. If someone else would like to read.
I can read a little bit. Y'all can hear me, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, just making sure. Okay, so solitude. Solitude is the condition for this self-expression. The tranquility of the soul is in fact necessary for self-knowledge. The relation to oneself that self-knowledge provides is not profoundly different from the knowledge of others and the relation to others. Congratulating one of his correspondents for withdrawing into solitude, Rousseau writes in 1739, "When the lantern reveals nothing, it is indeed a necessity to deal with oneself and to take oneself, lacking anyone else, as a friend and confidant. But we must be somewhat acquainted with this confidant and this friend, and know how and how much we can trust him. The perpetual nostalgia for the friend is to some extent satisfied by self-knowledge, which in the relation that it establishes consequently has the value of being. Furthermore, having experienced the world after the controversy of l'Hermitage, when Rousseau, can't get the French pronunciation down, feels the need for solitude like a passion, the search for self-knowledge becomes a method, but still retains an important aspect of spontaneity. Readers, I think willingly about myself, and I speak as I think, quotes. The act of expression possesses its value within itself, independent of precision. In the end, I am persuaded, writes Rousseau to Dom Deschamps, that one is always very well painted when one is painting oneself, even when the portrait bears no resemblance. These words may remind us of Spinoza's when he said that the idea is not like a silent image painting. Self-knowledge is not a self-portrait. It is a work that has a constructive value. Again, quote, I will make something unique, and I dare to say something truly beautiful. Self-knowledge immediately has the power to stabilize individual life by arresting the state of oscillation between the physical consternation provoking the slumber of the soul and the excessive feeling of misfortune, which provides the force to fight for truth. This stability of the reflexive state is expressed in a letter to Coindet on the 29th of March, 1766. With what will we be content in life if we are not content with the only man we cannot escape? This is how the confessions are a creation and a construction. The reveries reveal the same preoccupation. Again, quote, but myself, detached from them and from everyone, what am I myself? This is what remains for me to seek out. And another quote, I should not and do not want to occupy myself any longer except with myself. It is in this state that I reprise the succession of the severe and sincere examination that I once called my confession. From First Reverie. At the beginning of the fourth promenade, then in a preface meant for the reveries but abandoned, Rousseau renovates the Know Thyself of the Delphic Temple. This formula was ultimately written by Rousseau on the back of a playing card in 1776.
Right. So we see here a further development of this notion of self-knowledge and self-expression. So there's this idea of the portrait that is always accurate, even if it's inaccurate in some respects. So even if you sort of depict yourself in your self-expression in an inaccurate way, the fact of actually depicting yourself in this way is itself an expression of who you are. So you end up revealing yourself even if you sort of inaccurately depict yourself. And so there's a sort of immediate relation between self-knowledge and self-expression here. So it's only by sort of producing this self-expression that you can truly come to know who you are. And so for Rousseau, this exercise in autobiography is not just it's not that he has this sort of self-knowledge already contained within himself and then he just wants to share it with the rest of the world. It's by by producing this self-expression in the autobiography, it's in the exercise of producing it that you come to know yourself, and so so this self-expression is not just a kind of transfer of what is already contained within the self and sort of passing it to other people. It's a kind of production of this self-knowledge. So it's a kind of active self-knowledge as opposed to just sort of inspecting yourself, your sort of inner perception. And we can, I think, so the way Simondon puts it here is that Rousseau renovates the know thyself of the sort of ancient Greek formula of self-knowledge, and I think we can take the ancient Greek formulation as meaning something like knowing one's own essence, or having an understanding of what one really is, and this would be something that is kind of static in the sense that you sort of have a grasp of yourself that's independent of the various circumstances in which you might find yourself or the various events that happen in your life. Whereas for Rousseau, it's precisely through this sort of biographical development that you come to know yourself. So self-knowledge is a kind of production as opposed to a kind of contemplation for this sort of self-expressive self-knowledge. Maybe I'll also talk about a little bit about this concept of solitude and the necessity for solitude. We saw in Volume 1 the discussion of the ordeal of solitude in the sort of access to the trans individual, how the individual is capable of reaching something beyond itself and having access to something like a collective by means of this ordeal of solitude. And here we have a similar kind of sort of self-expression through withdrawal from the world. So it's only by solitude and sort of being at home with yourself or being alone with yourself that you are capable of producing this kind of self-expression that can be shared with others and that can allow others to know you as you really are. So there's a sort of reciprocity of this solitude that is required for self-knowledge, and then the kind of access to a collective or this connection with others that can only be achieved through going through this solitude.
Yeah, that stuck out to me as well. And I also wanted to see Volume 1 in this idea that the relation to the self is not really different in kind from the relation to others, which is why can't find where he says it now, but the line about the nostalgia for the friend being satisfied by self-knowledge, because obviously in Volume 1 it's the kind of affective relationship of the individual to itself, or I guess to the pre-individual share that it carries around, but by itself, that grounds or makes transindividuality possible.
Yeah, so in the same way so in Volume 1, he at one point in I believe it's Part 4, he makes a distinction between the individual and the subject. So the individual would be something that results from individuation, whereas the subject would be the individual plus the sort of portion of the pre-individual that it bears within it, or the something that has not yet been individuated. And I think we can likewise see here with Rousseau this kind of self-relation as a kind of connection between something that is already constituted or already produced on the one hand, and something that is still undergoing production or undergoing self-constitution on the other hand. So in the act of self-knowledge, insofar as it's a kind of active production of oneself at the same time as coming to know oneself, we start from a sort of entity that is already produced, or a self or aspect of ourself that is already produced, and then we sort of elaborate or construct or constitute through the process of self-knowledge, we sort of develop ourselves further and undergo a further individuation. So the subject, which contains this portion of the pre-individual within it, undergoes a further individuation. And it's precisely through this further individuation that we have access to this trans-individuality, or this connection with others that makes up the collective. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. I'll read the next, let's see. I'll read about a page. Okay. Nevertheless, the paradox of individuality still manifests in Rousseau from the beginning of the endeavor through a splitting. This splitting is from the start a splitting in time. Rousseau attempts to write his life at the age of 50. It is not the man of today that he expresses, but the man of yesteryear. Quote, I write the life of a man who is no longer, but whom I have known well, whose living soul has known only myself, and who deserves to be known. This man is myself. End quote. And yet this splitting is what permits recurrence and expression. Memory becomes the instrument of self-knowledge. However, memory is not a simple communication between the real self and the past self. I am my past. I cannot become conscious of this lived and living past, for it is the condition of all consciousness. But I can express it through the act of my present self, which is realized and realizes it in this expression. The present of the act of expression makes the present self react upon the past self, and consequently makes the self react upon itself, because the present self retains the potentials of the past self. Because the past engages the present, it continues to be in potential form in this present that it takes it up again. Consequently, the past animates the present, which orders the past. This schema of the recurrence of causality, characteristic of individuality, manifests throughout all the aspects of the unfolding of this longer endeavor. The evocation of this past happiness is in the retreat to Wooten, in the peacefulness of the present. The memory really actualizes in enjoyment. Quote, all the memories which I had to recall were for me so many fresh enjoyments. Unquote. On the contrary, when the conflict with Hume and the brothers of the continent disrupt Rousseau in July 1766, the narrative Rousseau takes up again becomes an act of pleading, full of judgments and moral reflections, like, for example, the episode of the stolen ribbon. The universe of conspiracy begins to organize in the present. Consequently, the evocation of the past is a defense, just as the present is a defense. This is the time at which Rousseau writes books 7 to 11 of the Confessions. The self appears to him as a third person then. Quote, I have here, he writes to Madame de Boufflers on the 5th of April, 1766, a man who is of my acquaintance and whom I long to know better. The company that I am going to connect to him will prevent me from desiring any other. I esteem him enough not to fear the intimacy to which he invites me. End quote. This man that he is appears to him like an immense chaos and a dark and filthy labyrinth. Having ordered this chaos, self-knowledge primarily aims at a what am I, and not a who am I. This demand for order and totality is so great, so essential, that it prevails against the objections arising from the classical conception of the meaning of the moral work, edification. Quote, if I silence anything, I will not know anything about it, as far as everything stands, as far as everything is one in my character, and as far as this strange and singular assemblage needs all the circumstances of my life to be revealed. Let's stop here. Right, so one bit I'll just mention here that is just sort of alluded to is this episode of the stolen ribbon that Simondon mentions. So this is a passage in the Confessions, one of the earlier books, I forget which one, but Rousseau is working as a kind of domestic servant in a noble household as a teenager or in his early 20s. I'm not exactly sure. The one of the members of the family that he's working for has this beautiful ribbon that Rousseau decides that he wants, and he steals it and hides it. One of the other servants gets blamed for it, and there's a sort of interrogation scene where the whole family and all the servants and everyone are all there, and the father of the household is interrogating this servant and blaming her for stealing this ribbon, and she keeps denying it, and eventually gets fired and sent away because of it. And Rousseau, of course, is there the whole time watching, knowing that he's the one who stole it, and he doesn't say anything. And he includes this shameful episode in his Confessions, and he says he doesn't sort of try to justify what he did, but he wants to. He says he wants to express everything about himself, including the shameful episodes because everything is connected in his life. So if he were to leave out even these shameful episodes, then he would make the rest of the biography incomprehensible. He wouldn't sort of fully express himself or produce this self knowledge in this full sense if he left out any episodes, no matter how shameful they are.
Quite surprising because I just heard about the Rousseau, like how immoral he was, because of regarding his family, like kind of, like he as far as I know, like he was not a responsible father, and then very, I mean, a lot of things like all together. That's why he tried to like justify, as you said, like justify his behaviors, and then kind of like gaps between his ideas and his actual life. That's why he just like wrote books, something like that. It's really contradictory and hypocritical.
Yeah, he is definitely a complicated person. Like, there's lots of different sort of aspects of his life that are sort of hard to fit together. Yeah, so I don't know this part. I've only read parts of the Confessions, but he later in life. So in is it the Discourse on Inequality or I forget which one. Anyway, he argues that mothers should take care of their children rather than giving them up to nurses, which was a sort of a common practice at the time for wealthy women. They would, give their children to be more or less raised by these nurses until they were, I don't know, 5 or 6 years old or whatever, and and then they would take them back at that point. And Rousseau argues against this practice, and he thinks that sort of he thinks it's unnatural in the sense that it sort of separates the child from its mother and prevents them from forming the kind of bond that they're supposed to form. But then at the same time, his own children, he put them up for either put them up for adoption or had them raised by nurses in the same way that he criticized uh, in his writings. So yes, I think we can certainly regard it as hypocritical. But he, one thing we can sort of praise him for, I guess, is for not hiding all of this stuff. He includes all of these things in his autobiography that we can blame him for as far as their actions, but he doesn't hide them from the world. He wants to express himself in this full sense, including all of the shameful parts of his biography.
Yeah, at the same time, definitely also like cast a question, like how much like individual psychic individuation and the collective individuation can go together. Maybe like it would definitely like inspire Simondong, and also kind of the I'm not sure, maybe like we can think of kind of a psychoanalysis of the other kind of philosophers like Lacan, or other people could have some ideas of Rousseau, or who's that, the Deleuze might have some interest in him too. Like, cause it's quite interesting, kind of like a split, like of the collectivity and then individuality.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. And it's interesting that you mentioned psychoanalysis because there is some mention of psychoanalysis here, but there's this very strange relationship that Rousseau had with this woman, Madame de Varenne, who I don't know how much older she was than him, but he sort of treats her as a surrogate mother because his mother died when either when he was born or when he was very young. I can't remember exactly. He treats her as a sort of surrogate mother, but she eventually becomes his mistress as well. And so this woman that he addresses as maman eventually becomes his mistress. And he even says himself after their first romantic encounter that he felt as if he had committed an incest. So there's obviously a lot that psychoanalysis can sort of read into this relationship that he had with his surrogate mother. Um, and Yeah, there's been lots of sort of secondary literature on this strange relationship, and sort of analyzing Rousseau as a person, like his psyche, I guess you could say, is a kind of academic research field, I guess. Like there's tons, like, precisely because he gives so much material to work with, it allows us to sort of perform some of these analyses on him as a person.
Yep, thank you.
A little strange that the Rousseau section is so long, and it seems like there are more quotes in this section than there are in previous sections on other philosophers.
Yeah, it is very odd that he would have like a 10-15 page long section on Rousseau and then no section on Kant in a sort of history of philosophy. I think possibly and you're right that there are definitely more quotes here than in previous sections. And I think possibly the reason for that is because Rousseau is not like a sort of systematic philosopher in the way that Kant or someone like that is, where you can just sort of summarize his doctrines in a sort of straightforward way. And even in this text on Rousseau, Simondon focuses on the autobiographical text and not on the essays. The essay on the social contract and on the origins of inequality and the origin of language and all these ones. So he focuses precisely on the less systematic or the less, I guess, directly philosophical texts. And so extracting some sort of philosophical meaning from those texts is sort of an operation that requires more interpretation than just saying, like, here's a summary of what Rousseau said about the origin of inequality or whatever other topic. So he sort of, I guess, wants to include a lot of these citations to sort of support his interpretation and support his reading of the sort of philosophical content into these autobiographical texts. And one other point that I wanted to mention in that last bit we just went through is this relationship with time. What Simondon here calls the recurrence of causality in the sort of temporal self-relation that is realized through self-knowledge. And we can also compare this to a passage in Volume 1 on the cogito, where Simondon analyzes the cogito in terms of the past and future self, or the past and present selves. So in performing the cogito, there's a kind of temporal distanciation of the self from itself. So you perform the act of doubting, and then that act of doubting is immediately sort of transferred into the past, and then you have to sort of connect your present act of doubting with this past act of doubting, and you have to sort of unite them into one self. You have to treat the past act of doubting as part of who you still are now. And likewise, in the autobiographical practice that Rousseau institutes here, he's writing as a relatively old man about his youth and his whole life history, and so he has to sort of separate himself from himself. He has to sort of set himself as a young man up as an object, or the Rousseau as an old man to analyze and to present to the world. But then at the same time, he also has to sort of treat this separate younger self or past self as part of who he is now. And so there's a kind of circular causation, I guess, where the past is what makes the present what it is what sort of brings about the form of the present. And then at the same time, the present sort of goes back into the past and organizes the past and sets it into a sort of chronological order that is comprehensible and expressible. So there's this kind of circular relation of causality between past and present.
Regarding that, actually, the part you read, what Hoso said, like he seemed to have interest in what am I, like not who am I, that part. So what Rousseau was interested in was the elements of, what composed of the human, not the transformation of the identities, like totally, like kind of like the past of me is like a part of a present of me, something like that. By doing the, like, what kind of elements, like, they consist of the human being, like, as a whole. So he focused on, like, the elements itself, like that the possibility of transformation of the identities, like from the past to the future, present to the future. Every phase we can be new, like, not that kind of thing, but the, as you mentioned, like something like a repetitive recycling, not recycling, like a recirculation, something like that.
Yeah, I think so. That's a good point to bring up, this distinction between what I am and who I am. And I think we can understand this distinction in terms of, so the question who am I would be a question sort of situating yourself in relation to others, like which person am I, or which social role do I occupy in the world. I think that's the type of question that Rousseau is not trying to ask. So he doesn't want to sort of compare himself to others and say which person am I, or which kind of person am I. He wants instead to sort of analyze himself into, as you said, elements. So he wants to say, so what is it that makes up the singularity of this person that I am? Which sort of elements of my life history have brought about this development into this person that I am now. And yeah, so it's a different kind of question than sort of situating yourself in relation to others. It's a kind of internal excavation, I guess, of like um, all the events and experiences that had to happen in order to lead up to who I am now, or as the person writing this autobiography, I am this particular person because I went through all these experiences.
Okay, thank you.
Oh yeah, and 61 has also pointed to another sentence which is important here. So there's the sentence: "This demand for order and totality is so great, so essential, that it prevails against the objections arising from the classical conception of the meaning of the moral work, edification." So I think here, so the sort of so what Simondon is referring to with this, when he talks about the classical conception of the meaning of the moral work, is that there's all these texts that are mostly sort of forgotten now, but these texts where the writers try to instill a sort of moral sentiment in the reader. They sort of depict these situations where you have this moral reaction of sympathy for someone in suffering, or whatever other sort of situation is meant to inspire these sort of moral sentiments, where you learn to become a good person by sort of going through these experiences in thought, in reading a novel or a poem or whatever that is meant to be edifying. It's meant to instill this sort of moral sense within you. And Rousseau's work is definitely not an edifying work in that sense, even though it is meant as a kind of moral work. So Rousseau depicts all these, everything that he does, and including the shameful actions like stealing the ribbon. Um, and he doesn't present these actions for the sake of edification. He doesn't show how vice is punished and virtue is rewarded, and so on. He shows these episodes because he wants to express himself as he is and not hide anything about himself. And so this process of self knowledge, or this process of expression of oneself, is a distinct project from the one of edification. And it's precisely because Rousseau argues that everything about himself is connected and united with everything else, that he has to express even these shameful episodes. Whereas if his goal was edification, he might sort of hide those episodes and only show the parts of himself that lead the reader to virtue and being a good person and so on. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit if someone else would like to read.
Are we at the conception?
Yes.
Okay. The conception of the individual that emerges from this reflexive labor involves an initial aspect that is worthy of interest. We are full of prior impressions that, quote, we carry without us noticing, unquote. Rousseau notes this, quote, while probing in myself and looking in others for what these various manners of being are attached to, I found that they depended largely on the previous impression of external objects, unquote. So we are not completely ourselves, and things make us partly what we are. Here Rousseau finds an inexhaustible foundation for individual originality. Under these conditions, the body has a power over the soul. Quote, everything acts on our machine and consequently on our soul, unquote. This lesson will be taken up by Maine de Burin, who will propose to study the rapport of the physical and the mental. The observations that Rousseau makes in Book 9 of the Confessions were to lead to a book that would have had the title Sensitive Morality, or the Materialism of the Sage, and was never completed. The difficulty in thinking individuality is expressed here by the obscurity of the reciprocal action of the physical and the moral, an action through which a perpetual possibility of splitting is perceived. Reduction to unity seems impossible and dishonest to Rousseau. He forcefully attacks the recently published English book, Research on the Soul, where, quote, by virtue of I don't know how many fine and entirely conclusive anatomical details, it is proven that there is no soul, since the author hasn't seen one at the origin of the nerves, unquote. And it's this reason that leads Rousseau in the second dialogue to criticize the claims of the, quote, philosopher surgeons. He prefers, in the rapport of the physical to the moral, to accept without comprehending the quote-unquote many contradictions by declaring that he does not seek to, quote, resolve them like a physicist, unquote. Refusing the materialist simplification, Rousseau nevertheless notes the influence not of the body, but of objects in the external world, what we today call the milieu, on the soul, and on the passions in particular. In letter 23 of the New Eloise, Saint-Preux expresses himself in the following way, quote, I admire the influence of the most insensible beings on our liveliest passions, and I despise philosophy for having no more effect on the soul than a succession of inanimate objects, unquote. This succession of inanimate objects is in fact constituted by the whole world in which Saint-Preux lives and perceives. The purity of the air is correlated with inner peace. Quote, it was there that I substantially disentangled in the purity of the air, where I was the real cause of the change of my mood and the return of that inner peace I had lost for so long. Inversely, the imagination can act on the body. Quote, the source of my agitation resides in an overactive imagination, ready to take fright at everything and magnify it to the furthest extreme. The imagination consequently predetermines the occurrence of real states. Quote, a sad penchant to foresee all the misfortunes that I fear and a cruel exactitude of fate to justify all my fears ensures my own, unquote. The soul prepares the body for a future that it organizes. The effect is just as intense for the past. Quote, the description of my past pains would make me feel them all again, and my imagination, revived by the depiction of so many evils, would make them so painful to me that the best doctor in the world could not cure them, quote. It is therefore necessary to discover an order for this reciprocal action in the movements of the body. Quote, from how many errors would reason be saved? How many vices would be kept from being born if we knew how to force the animal economy to favor the moral order it so often troubles, unquote. It is therefore possible to order the reciprocal action of the soul on the body. This is one of the ways in which psychological analysis, responding to the question, what am I, makes it possible to inform the original chaos. It kind of seems like here the relation between the soul and the body is still a difficult question, even though not logically impossible in the way that it was for Descartes.
Yeah, here the relationship is not just between the soul and the body, but between the soul and the physical environment. And so Rousseau sort of depicts throughout the Confessions how the environment, the sun and the plants around him and so on, sort of influence his moral state or the state of his soul. That he's sort of set into a particular state by being in particular surroundings. And actually, there's a footnote here. There's a couple later on as well, that where Simondon sort of analyzes Rousseau as having a respiratory temperament, in the sense that his emotional state is determined by the state of his respiration. And so when he's in the city and there's no plants, and he feels this sort of oppressive sense of not being able to breathe, then he's in a sort of depressed moral state. Whereas when he's in the countryside and he smells the flowers and the hay and whatever, then he feels a sense of exaltation, and he feels like he can breathe properly. Respiratory or mountain dwelling type. So Simondon, he sort of qualifies this explanation of Rousseau's temperament, and he says that so if a study of the morphology of temperaments was certain enough, we would present Rousseau as being connected to the respiratory or mountain dwelling type. So he does sort of qualify his statement, but there are a few footnotes throughout this section on Rousseau where he connects Rousseau's sort of moral state or emotional state to the environment, and in particular whether or not he's surrounded by plants. But yes, I think in particular the relation between the body and the soul is now understood as a sort of moral problem as opposed to a logical problem. So it's not a question of how do we make consistent the existence of the soul and the existence of the body. How do we sort of combine these two entities into a coherent system? The question is, how, as a particular person in the world, how do I sort of find the surroundings in which I can sort of express myself in the most adequate way, or where I can sort of be who I truly am by virtue of being in the proper surroundings. 61 is that passage from the Discourse on Inequality, or that quote that you posted there? Oh, okay. So so there's this quote from Cassira's essay on Kant and Rousseau. So the distinction between l'homme de l'homme and l'homme de la nature. So it would be like the man for other men, or the man of men versus the man of nature, I guess would be the translation of that. But so there's this opposition for, like, Rousseau constantly makes this opposition between sort of the natural human being, so what a human being is in accordance with its own internal nature, and then in sort of harmony with external nature on the one hand, and then the way that sort of the social world constrains the natural sort of inclinations of the human being, or the natural formation of the human being, and puts the human being into these kind of forms that are unnatural. Okay, so let's go on to the next page. If someone else would like to read.
Okay, let me read. But this order, right?
Yes, exactly.
But this order is not an ultimate victory. The term of the body, until then considered as a simple, reveals itself to be double, charged with a rapport of incompatibility, to the point that the first effort to introduce order into the relation of the physical and the moral does nothing but move the problem of individual unity backwards. Its completion unmasks a deeper and incoercible duality of the vital dynamism, that of temperament, which Rousseau still calls physical constitution, end of quote. Quote, of all the men I have known, end of quote, says Rousseau, judge of Jean-Jacques. Quote, the one whose character derives most completely from his temperament alone in Jean-Jacques, the end of quote. Second dialogue. In the Confessions, he expresses the duality of forces that come from the head, from the heart, from the entrails, and from the disturbances of the blood. Quote, two things almost incompatible are united in me in a manner which I'm unable to understand. A very ardent temperament, lively and tumultuous passions, and at the same time slowly developed and confused ideas, which never present themselves until it is too late. End of quote. The second dialogue still expresses this internal contradiction of temperament. Also discovers in himself, quote, a mixed temperament, formed of apparently contradictory elements, a sensitive, passionate, or easily inflamed heart, and a dense and sluggish brain whose solid and massive parts can only be put in motion by prolonged and lively agitation of the blood. End of quote. The contradictory aspects of his temperament are thus opposites, like liveliness and slowness. These two movements are movements of life, and their contradiction cannot be resolved into unity within reflection. In this sense, it is at the moment when the Wootton in 1766, Rousseau begins to sometimes feel life fade in him, and the fear of death arises that he reveals the most remarkable analysis of the order of living, of this order that possessed him since adolescence. At the time when Rousseau writes the Marshalhof in May 1766, quote, my nights are cool, my body suffers even more than my heart. Total loss of sleep reveals the saddest ideas to me. The air of the country combines the somber influence with all this, and I begin to frequently feel that I have lived too much. End of quote. He describes in the following way the strength of adhering to nature. Quote, well, this throws me into the immensity of beings, to combine them, to choose them, to appropriate them as I see fit, without shame and without fear. End of quote. Also, then finds in the middle state between health and sickness a sort of equilibrium between pure existence without consciousness, which he calls a strength, and life accompanied by consciousness, which requires a sickly state in the strongest sickness. The soul is alienated from itself. Quote, my soul, alienated from itself, is all in my body. End of quote. Writes Rousseau to Melchorhoff. But full health is also a harmful state. Quote, I hate this robust health. Those people who have so much strength and so little life. It seems to me that I have lived only since I felt half dead. End of quote. Life conscious of itself is therefore a state of equilibrium between strength and sickness. Vital activity and the exercise of the soul's faculties can then coexist, and it seems that temperament itself becomes unified in a stable modus vivendi. Continue?
Right. Yeah. No, let's stop here. Thanks.
Welcome.
Let's see. Yeah. So we had this sort of opposition, this moral problem of the body and the soul, or how the soul is influenced by the physical world. But then this problem sort of descends into the order of the body itself. So the body is not just one term in this opposition, but the body is itself sort of split into these two contrary tendencies. So he calls this or he talks about the opposition between the heart and the brain on the one hand, or something. He also, I think we'll see this a little bit later, he talks about the distinction between life and force. So he thinks that his temperament, or the sort of constitution of his body, is itself contradictory, in the sense that it has this kind of quick reaction of the heart. So his passions are inflamed quickly, whereas his ideas or his brain responds slowly to whatever circumstances are brought up. And so his temperament has this sort of contradictory nature within it already. And so even before the relation between the body and the soul is in question, the body itself, or the physical temperament of the body, is already contradictory. And to sort of manage this contradiction, he has to find this kind of intermediate state between health and sickness. So when you're fully healthy, when you have this robust health, as he calls it, you sort of live without reflection. You just sort of do the things that you are want to do. You perform your actions. You engage in life in this sort of straightforward way, and then you don't sort of reflect on who you are or what you're doing. And then in a state of sort of sort of engage in self-reflection. But when you're in this intermediate state, when you're in a kind of sickly state, but not too sickly, you you have the you still have the strength to engage in self-reflection, but you're not sort of immediately engaged in life in the way that you would be if you were fully healthy. And so it's this intermediate state of sort of semi-sickness that allows Rousseau to balance these two contradictory tendencies that he finds within himself in terms of his physical temperament. And so there's a kind of paradoxical quality to the fact that he can only sort of express the vitality of life or the will to live when he's in a state that he himself describes as being half dead, where he is sick and he's old and he's sick and he feels like he's lived too long, and then he is only in this state that he can sort of reflect on his life and express the sort of vitality of his existence in a previous state. Yeah, that's a good expression. So 61 is put in the chat here that we can call this Rousseau's paradox of health. And yeah, so that's a good expression for this sort of difficulty in grasping one's life, I guess we could put it. So insofar as one is healthy, one just sort of acts and engages in life without reflection, and then insofar as one is sick, one doesn't have the strength to engage in the reflection. So we need to find this sort of intermediate state of semi-sickness or partial sickness that allows us to reflect on our lives and sort of express the vitality of life.
I think I'm not the only one who would think of the process of individuation, psychic individuation, because the part this part reminds me of the process of metastable phase, like how potential is coexisting at the metastable state, like as a something like a coexistence of some kind of like a state, like that's why like thinking about the Kant, as far as I understand, the Kant must have been like the philosopher of order, kind of like the Hegel and the Kant tried to make the world orderly. On the other hand, like this kind of Rousseau, like it's a full of contradiction, like in a way, kind of like in a way the presentation of madness, and it gives it definitely it might have given some kind of ideas of individuation process to Simondon.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. So this state of semi-sickness is a kind of metastable state, as you pointed out. So it in the sense that it provides a certain kind of stability, but at the same time it contains potentials for further development for this self-expression that we can only perform in this state of semi-sickness. So it's a metastable state in that sense. And I think you're right also that Simondon draws a lot of his understanding of psychic individuation from his analysis of Rousseau. I'm not sure sort of chronologically which comes first in terms of which text Simondon wrote first, whether he sort of developed his analysis of psychic individuation first and then wrote this text analyzing Rousseau, or whether he did the analysis of Rousseau first and then went back and sort of drew the lessons from it in the psychic individuation chapter. But he was writing both texts, in around the same time in the late 50s. So we can definitely, I think, see a kind of reciprocal relation between the two, that each one is sort of, we can understand each of these texts in connection with the other.
Thank you. One more kind of like a quick question about Malherbe. Is it the person, like person?
Oh yes. So it's pronounced Malherbe.
Malherbe. So it's another philosopher or friend of Rousseau. Somebody.
I'm not sure who he is exactly, but someone that Rousseau was corresponding with. Rousseau writes letters to Malherbe, and in his old age, and he's sort of expressing his state of sickness and old age and his feeling of being half dead. But in connection or because of this state of sickness, he's able to express the vitality of his life in a way that he wouldn't be able to express if he were in a better state of health.
Okay, thank you. I just found like a Wikipedia. It has a quatre lettres, which means like 4 letters in between, like between.
Yeah,
Yeah, seems like.
yeah, that's right. I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know this correspondence at all. Like all I know is what I read here in this text, Simondon. So yeah, I'm not sure like how many letters they wrote to each other and so on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Apparently, I'm just checking his Wikipedia entry. So apparently, he contributed to the publication of the Encyclopédie, which we'll see a bit more later after the Rousseau section. So Diderot and D'Alembert, who Rousseau also sort of corresponded with, published the Encyclopédie in the late 18th century, which was a sort of compilation of scientific knowledge of the time and sort of expressed the anti-clerical, anti-monarchist philosophy of the 18th century, and I guess is sort of considered an expression of the sort of 18th century liberalism and the sort of the third estate, the class that was neither nobles nor part of the clergy, the sort of self-expression of the third estate prior to the French Revolution. So yeah, so Malherbe was involved in publication of the Encyclopédie. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. I think we have time for probably one more section. If someone else would like to read from this contradiction.
I can read this one probably. This contradiction. Oh, no problem. This contradiction in reciprocal action doesn't just manifest in the temperament taken in its totality as an opposition between liveliness and slowness. It also manifests within each of the tendencies and for example, the sexual tendency and amorous behavior. Rousseau's masochism, linking enjoyment with pain, victory with humiliation, triumph with the experience of punishment, deploys itself starting with the corporal corrections inflicted by Mademoiselle Lambercière, all the way up to the amorous states of the mature man. Ardor and inhibition become associated and linked together in the complex development of a reciprocal action. Feeling arises, radiates outward, is transmitted to the body, is expressed in heat, words, and silent gestures, then abruptly restrains itself and reverberates within the soul under the blow of a painful inhibition. And yet, the reciprocal action integrates the play of external circumstances, which makes a development unpredictable. This is why sensuality is never the only force that creates an emotion. Rousseau declares in the second dialogue, sensual more than it should be, but not enough to be just that. There exists a, quote, moral sensitivity that is, quote, is nothing but the faculty of attaching our affections to beings which are foreign to us. He depends much more on his senses, and he would depend on them even more so if moral sensitivity didn't often provide diversion. Quote, beautiful sounds, a beautiful sky, a beautiful landscape, a beautiful lake, flowers, aromas, beautiful eyes, a pleasing look, all of which reacts on one's senses only after having pierced somehow into one's heart. Consequently, individual duality persists even in the liveliest outpouring of love. In the same way, Rousseau manifests the duality in the motivation and external appearance of sexual behaviors. Quote, do I not therefore have strict morals only because I have depraved tastes? Wonders Rousseau, who evokes the memory by thinking about the manifestations that psychoanalysis and psychopathology call masochism, autoerotism, exhibitionism, fetishism. This fundamental ambiguity survives under the apparent unity of adult behavior. Quote, when I become a man, that childish taste, instead of vanishing, only associated with the other that I never could remove from my sensual desires. The transition from simple masochism to the behaviors of the adult is continuous. Quote, I enjoyed acts of submission. I thus found a way to approach the object of my lust from some vantage, conflating the attitude of a suppliant lover with that of a penitent schoolboy. It is the same sexual pleasure that is coveted from Mademoiselle Lambercière, punishment to the terrors experienced at the feet of Madame Basile. To fall at the feet of an imperious mistress, obey her mandates, or implore pardon procures for Rousseau an enjoyment of the body and soul. Masochism therefore reaches the elevated style of courtly love. We understand why Rousseau demands a complete expression of his reality. What is seen is not the least part of what is. We see the apparent effect, the internal cause of which is hidden and quite often comes in the preamble to the Annales. 4. The habit to express each feeling with antagonistic terms is explained in this way. Quote, even though sometimes next to the ones I loved, I was carried away by the furies of a passion that deprived me of the faculty of seeing and of hearing, out of my senses and seized with a convulsive trembling in my whole body. Wait, I should repeat that quote. I think I emphasized it wrong. Even though sometimes next to the ones I loved, I was carried away by the furies of a passion that deprived me of the faculty of seeing and of hearing, out of my senses, and seized with a convulsive trembling in my whole body. I don't know. Sorry about the enunciation. My brain isn't working today.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, so this is where there's the psychoanalytic bit here, or the reference to psychoanalysis. So Rousseau describes in the Confessions his experience as a young man. I'm not sure exactly, or a boy, I guess. I'm not sure exactly how old he was. Where this Mademoiselle Lambertier thanked him, and he as a punishment, and he enjoyed this, and he sort of associated this experience with sexuality for the rest of his life, and so he has this sort of masochistic, I guess, inclination in his sexual desires, that he sort of he connects with the sort of tradition of courtly love, of having the setting up the mistress, or the uh, the mistress as being someone to be obeyed, and to as someone who sort of dominates the desiring party, and so Rousseau treats this sort of courtly love tradition as a way of sort of expressing his masochism, and so, as he says here, he combines the attitude of a suppliant lover with that of a penitent schoolboy, and so he kind of combines the two into one strange entity. And so obviously there's lots of like psychoanalytic interpretation you could apply to these kinds of strange combinations. So Simondon interprets this in terms of the this duality, or this splitting of the self, that is sort of the way that this paradox of individuality realizes itself in the 18th century, in this era of expression. So even in something like sexuality, there's a kind of splitting of the self into the one who enjoys and the one who is punished, or something like that. And so the self, or Rousseau as a person, is able to find enjoyment in sexual desire only through sort of setting himself up as the one to be punished, and sort of making this kind of split within himself.
I think Rousseau was really, really super liberal at the time.
Yeah, he was definitely like criticized for his sort of explicitness in terms of how he describes his sort of singular sexual desires. He was definitely considered, or he was criticized as being immoral for expressing these desires in this way. And yeah, so there's I think, I mean, in terms of sort of contemporary standards, he's fairly tame. He's not like describing anything in explicit terms. He makes sort of allusions to these things, but for the 18th century reader, he was considered pretty sort of extreme in terms of the amount of sexual content that was included in his works. Oh, and 61 has posted a comment here about Colin Morris's book, The Discovery of the Individual, 1050 to 1200. A book that I don't know actually, but that apparently connects the idea of the individual with the courtly love tradition. So yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to check that out. Okay, so I think we're pretty much at time. Let's just see where we are. Yeah, I think we can stop here. We have several more pages on Rousseau, so we'll probably spend the whole of the next session on Rousseau, and possibly into the next one. But yeah, let's stop here for today.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you so much. See you next week.
All right, thanks everyone. See you next week.
Thanks, Don. Thanks, everyone.
Bye bye.